Welcome to Relative, our family mess. Here, I bring you the raw, unspoken stories of older men betrayed by the very families they spent a lifetime protecting, and the dark secrets hidden within the modern home. Now, here is today's story.
The phone rang at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something was wrong. A man my age learns the language of the telephone. A call in the middle of the afternoon is business. A call in the early evening is family checking in. But a call at 1 in the morning is never good news. It is the hour when hospitals call, when police call, when the worst things in the world come crawling down the line and into your ear. I had been sleeping in the recliner again, the way I do most nights since my wife passed. The bedroom upstairs felt too big and too empty without Elizabeth in it. So more often than not, I drifted off downstairs with the television murmuring to itself. My name is Sullivan Compton. I am 67 years old, and for nearly 4 decades I built a company from nothing but a borrowed truck, a toolbox, and an electrical engineering degree I worked the night shift to pay for. Compton Industrial Electric. I wired factories, hospitals, water treatment plants, the kind of buildings where one careless mistake could cost a man his life. I learned early that electricity does not forgive sloppiness. It does not care how tired you are or how late it is. It only follows the laws it was given, every single time, without exception. People can lie. Numbers can be fudged. But current always tells the truth, because it can do nothing else. I fumbled for the phone on the side table, my fingers thick and clumsy with sleep. The screen glowed too bright in the dark room. The name on it made my chest tighten before I even answered. It was a neighbor of my daughter's, a woman named Skylar, who lived 2 doors down from Adeline and watered her plants when she traveled. "Mr. Compton," she said, and her voice was shaking. "Mr. Compton, you need to come. It's Adeline's house. It's on fire. The whole thing is on fire." For a moment, I did not move. I did not breathe. The words arranged themselves in my mind slowly, like pieces of equipment I could not quite identify. Adeline's house, on fire. Then something in me that had been still for a long time came roaring back to life. I do not remember standing up. I do not remember pulling my boots on over bare feet, or grabbing my coat from the hook by the door. The next clear memory I have is of the cold steering wheel under my hands and the engine of my old truck turning over in the driveway, the headlights cutting 2 pale tunnels into the freezing autumn dark. Adeline is my only child. She is 34 years old now, though when I close my eyes I still see her at 6, following me around job sites in a hard hat 3 sizes too big, asking me what every wire did and where it went. She grew up to be a landscape architect, a woman who builds gardens the way I built circuits, with patience and care and an eye for the things other people miss. She bought that house 3 years ago, and when she bought it, I did something I had never done for any client in my entire career. I wired it myself. Every outlet, every junction box, every run of copper behind those walls. I pulled the old aluminum wiring out with my own hands and replaced it with the best materials money could buy. Breakers rated higher than any home would ever need. Grounding done to a standard I would have demanded on a hospital surgical wing. I stood in that house for weeks, checking each connection twice, because it was not a job. It was my daughter's home. It was the safest house in that whole town. And I knew it, the way a man knows the sound of his own heartbeat. I had labeled every breaker in clean block letters. I had torqued every lug to specification. There was not a frayed strand or a loose neutral anywhere in that building, because I would not have allowed it to exist. That is the thought that would not leave me as I drove. The roads were empty and slick with the first frost of the season. I ran 2 red lights. I did not care. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but underneath the fear, somewhere cold and quiet in the back of my mind, A question was already forming, a question I did not want to ask. How does the safest house in town simply catch fire in the dead of night? Before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are in the world right now, watching this, let me know in the comments what city or country you are from, and if you believe that a father will do absolutely anything to protect his child. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. You are going to want to hear how this ends, because what happened that night was not an accident. I just did not know it yet. I came over the last rise before her street, and that is when I saw it. The sky above the tree line was glowing a deep, terrible orange, pulsing against the clouds like a wound. I could smell the smoke before I even rolled the window down. My hands tightened on the wheel until my knuckles ached. My daughter's house was burning, and every instinct I had built over 40 years was screaming that fire had no business being there at all. I left my truck in the middle of the street with the door hanging open and the engine still running. Adeline's house was a torch. Flames poured out through the front windows and clawed up the siding toward the roof, and the heat hit me like a wall from 30 feet away. So fierce it dried the tears on my face before they could fall. 2 fire engines crouched in the yard, their lights spinning red and white across the smoke. Hoses snaked over the frozen grass. Men in heavy coats moved through the orange glow, shouting words I could not hear over the roar. I tried to run toward the house. A firefighter caught me around the chest with one thick arm and held me back. "Sir, you can't go in there." "My daughter," I said. The word came out cracked and small. "My daughter lives here. Adeline. Where is she? Where is my daughter?" He turned his head and yelled to someone behind him, and then the whole world narrowed down to a single point. 2 paramedics were coming around the side of the house, and between them, on a stretcher, was Adeline. I have seen men hurt on job sites. I have seen burns and falls, and the terrible things that happen when a person forgets that electricity is patient and unforgiving. But nothing in 40 years prepared me for the sight of my own child lying there. Her skin streaked gray with soot, an oxygen mask pressed over her face, her body limp and still under the blanket they had thrown over her. Her dark hair was singed at the edges. Her hands, those careful hands that planted gardens, hung loose off the side of the stretcher. Adeline. I broke free and stumbled to her side, taking one of those hands in both of mine. It was warm. She was alive. The paramedic told me she was breathing, but unconscious, that she had taken in a great deal of smoke, that they needed to get her to the hospital right now. I climbed halfway into the ambulance before they gently moved me aside, promising me they would take care of her, telling me which hospital, telling me to follow, and then they were gone, the siren rising and fading into the dark. And I was standing alone in the firelight, shaking. That should have been the only thing in my mind. My daughter, hurt, racing toward a hospital. Any father would have thought of nothing else. But I am not only a father, I am an electrician. And for 40 years, I have been trained to look at fire and read it the way other men read a page. So I stood there in the freezing yard, and I looked. The fire was wrong. I cannot explain it to you in a single sentence. The way I felt it in my gut before my mind could put it into words. A house fire has a grammar to it. It has a logic. Fire is lazy and predictable. It starts in one place. It climbs. It follows fuel and air. It leaves a story written in char and smoke that any trained eye can read backward to its source. An electrical fire, the kind they would later try to sell me, smolders. It begins small, hidden inside a wall or a box, creeping along until it finds enough to burn. It is slow at the start. It announces itself with the smell of hot insulation long before it shows a flame. This fire had not crept. This fire had bloomed. It was burning too hot and too evenly across the ground floor, low and wide, the way a fire burns when something has been poured to help it along. The flames had a strange, restless color I did not like. Flashes of color that wood alone does not make. And the smoke, rolling black and thick into the night sky, carried a smell underneath the wood and the plastic that did not belong there. Something sharp and chemical that caught in the back of my throat and would not leave. I told myself I was a grieving old man imagining things. I told myself I was in shock, that my mind was reaching for any explanation other than the simple, cruel randomness of an accident. But the cold, quiet part of my mind, the part that had never once been wrong about a circuit, kept whispering the same impossible thing. There was nothing in that house that could have started this. I had wired it myself. I knew every inch of copper behind those walls. There was no frayed line, no overloaded box, no lazy connection waiting to spark in the dark. I had built that house to be the one place in the world where my daughter would always be safe from the very thing I had spent my life respecting and fearing. I had checked the panel a dozen times. I had slept easier, knowing it was done right, and it had burned to the ground anyway. I turned, looking for the one face I expected to see, the face of the man who should have been standing here in his bathrobe, screaming, broken, the way I was. Adeline's husband. Evan. He was not there. I asked the neighbors gathering at the edge of the yard. I asked Skylar, who stood crying with a coat thrown over her nightgown. Evan was out of town. They told me. A business trip. He had left 2 days ago. How convenient, I thought. And then I hated myself for the thought. Because what kind of father lets his mind go to such a place while his daughter rides unconscious toward a hospital? But the thought did not leave. It sat there, patient and ugly, refusing to be dismissed. I looked back at the burning house, at the fire that had no right to exist, and I felt something cold settle into my chest, colder than the frost under my boots. The flames were telling me a lie, and I was going to find out who lit them. I followed the ambulance to Riverside General and spent the rest of that night in a plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, still wearing my coat over my undershirt. Soot from the yard drying on my hands. The doctors would not let me see her at first. A nurse came out around 3 in the morning and told me Adeline was stable but critical. The smoke had done damage to her lungs, and there was a head injury they could not fully explain. A deep bruise above her temple that the fall, they said, or a piece of falling debris, might have caused. They had put her into a medically induced sleep to let her body rest. She was breathing with help. She was alive. That was all I let myself hold on to. I sat there and I prayed, which is something I had not done with any seriousness since Elizabeth died. I prayed, and I waited, and I tried very hard not to think about the color of those flames, or about the head injury that a falling beam was supposed to explain. Evan arrived a little after 6. I heard him before I saw him, his voice carrying down the corridor, loud and breathless. "Where is she? Where's my wife? Somebody tell me where my wife is." He came around the corner in a charcoal overcoat that looked freshly pressed, his hair combed, a leather travel bag still over his shoulder. He had driven through the night, he said, the moment he heard. 5 hours straight from a hotel 3 states away. I stood up to meet him, and for one moment, grief made me forget every cold suspicion of the night before. He was family. Whatever I felt about him, he was Adeline's husband, and we were both about to lose our minds with worry. I reached out to put a hand on his shoulder, and then I looked at him. I have spent my whole life reading things that other men overlook. The hairline crack in a poured slab, the faint discoloration on a breaker that tells you it has been running hot, the small wrong details that mean the whole structure is not what it appears to be. And standing there in that corridor, with my hand on Evan's shoulder, I saw the small wrong details all over him. His eyes were dry. A man who has driven 5 hours through the night believing his wife might die does not arrive with dry eyes and combed hair. His coat was crisp. His hands were steady. When he asked the nurse about Adeline's condition, he asked the right words in the right order, the way a man recites a speech he has practiced. And when the doctor explained how serious it was, I watched his face arrange itself into grief a half-second too late. The way an actor reaches for an expression rather than feeling it rise on its own, I told myself, again, that I was a bitter old man looking for a villain. People grieve in different ways. Shock makes some men cold. I knew all of that. I said all of it to myself, but I had felt that same wrongness standing in front of the fire. 2 wrong things in one night is no longer a coincidence. It is a pattern. And patterns have causes. The doctor who came to speak with us was a tired woman named Itzayana Mullins, kind-eyed and careful with her words. She told us that the next few days were critical and that decisions about Adeline's care would need to be made. And the moment she said the word decisions, Evan stepped forward, smooth as oil, and put himself between her and me. "I'm her husband," he said. "I have medical power of attorney. Whatever needs deciding, I'll handle it. Sullivan here is her father. But he's, well," he gave the doctor a small, sad, knowing smile. "He's taken this very hard. He's not himself. I think it's best if I'm the point of contact." I felt the words land like a slap. He was cutting me out, right there in the hallway, gently and publicly, painting me as a broken old man who could not be trusted with my own daughter's care. And Dr. Mullins, who had no reason to doubt him, simply nodded and made a note. I opened my mouth to protest, and Evan turned to me with a look of such tender concern that anyone watching would have thought he was the kindest man alive. "Sullivan, you should go home and rest. You've been up all night. Let me take care of this. Let me take care of her. It's the least I can do." I held my tongue. It took everything in me. But I held it, because the cold part of my mind, the part that does not panic, had begun to understand that this was a man I could not fight head-on. Not yet. Not with grief off and accusations and an old man's instincts. He held the legal papers. He held the doctor's trust. If I made a scene, I would only prove his story about me true. A wise man does not grab a live wire with his bare hands. He shuts off the power first, quietly, where no one is looking. So I nodded. I said I would go home. I let him think he had won. But as I gathered my coat, I caught the eye of a young nurse standing near the desk, a woman whose name tag read Harper Vang. She had been watching Evan the whole time, quietly, the way I had been watching him. When our eyes met, she did not look away. She gave me the smallest nod, so slight that Evan never saw it. She had noticed it too, whatever it was. I walked out of that hospital into the gray morning light. My daughter sealed away behind a wall of locked doors and legal papers, and a son-in-law who had just made very sure I could not get past it. They wanted me to believe this was an accident, and that my place was at home, out of the way. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I did not go home and rest. I drove back to the house. In the gray light of late morning, the place looked even worse than it had in the dark. The fire was out, but the ruin it left behind was complete. The roof had collapsed over the back half of the structure. The front windows were black, empty sockets. The siding had blistered and curled away from the frame, and the whole lot reeked of wet ash and that same sharp chemical smell that had caught in my throat the night before. Yellow tape ringed the property. A fire department van sat in the driveway, A man in a clean windbreaker was already walking the perimeter with a clipboard, snapping photographs. He had the look of someone who had decided what he was going to find before he arrived. I learned his name was Kenzo Mata, a private fire investigator. Not from the city, not from the fire marshal's office. A private man hired, I would later learn, by the insurance side of things to determine cause and origin. I stood at the tape and watched him work, and within 20 minutes I knew exactly what kind of investigation this was going to be. A proper origin investigation is slow. You dig. You sift the debris layer by layer. You read the burn patterns on the studs and the floor. You look for the lowest and deepest point of charring. You trace the V patterns up the walls back to where the fire was hottest and longest. Because that is where it began. It takes hours. It takes care. It is in its own way. Exactly like the work I spent my life doing. Reading a structure backward to find the single point where everything went wrong. Kenzo Mata did none of that. He walked the outside. He took his photographs. He poked at the blackened remains of the electrical panel on the exterior wall, made a few notes, and within the hour he was peeling off his gloves. I could not stop myself. I ducked under the tape and walked up to him. "You found the cause already?" I asked. He looked at me the way men like him look at men like me, an old man in a soot-stained coat. "And you are Sullivan Compton, her father." Something flickered across his face, gone too fast to name. "I'm sorry for what your family's going through, sir, but you shouldn't be inside the tape." He gathered his clipboard against his chest. "Early indication is an electrical fault. The wiring in these older homes, it happens more than you'd think. A connection works loose, arcs over time, finds something to ignite. Tragic. But these things happen. The wiring in these older homes," I looked at the burned panel he had been poking at, and a cold, slow anger began to build in my chest, the kind that doesn't flare but settles, like a foundation curing into something that will not move. "That panel is 2 years old," I said quietly. "So, is every run of wire behind those walls." "I know, because I pulled the old aluminum out of this house with my own hands and replaced all of it. I installed that panel. Those are commercial-grade breakers, rated far above anything a home draws. Every connection in there was torqued to specification and checked twice. There is no loose connection in that house. Mr. Mata, there was nothing in that wiring that could arc, because I didn't leave anything in it that could—" He stared at me for a long moment. And here is the thing I will never forget. A man who had simply made an honest, quick judgment would have been curious. He would have asked me questions. He would have said, "Well, then let's take another look." That is what an investigator does when new information contradicts him. Kenzo Mata did not look curious. He looked uncomfortable. "I'm sure you did good work, sir," he said. "But components fail, even good ones. I'll note your concerns in the report." And he turned and walked to his van. And I understood that my concerns would be noted exactly the way a man notes something he intends to forget. I was still standing there when Evan's car pulled up. He got out talking on his phone, and he did not see me at first. He was pacing in the driveway, his voice low and businesslike, and I caught only fragments before he noticed me. The words I caught were enough: policy, claim. He was saying something about how soon the payout could be processed, whether the investigation would slow things down, whether there was any way to expedite given the circumstances. Then he heard my boots on the gravel and turned, and the businesslike voice vanished into that warm, terrible softness. "Sullivan, you shouldn't be here. This isn't good for you." "What were you on the phone about?" I asked. A flicker. Then the smooth recovery. "The insurance. Somebody has to handle it. And well," he sighed, as if it pained him. "There's Adeline's inheritance to think about. the trust her mother left. With her like this, unable to manage her affairs. All of that falls to me now, as her husband. It's a terrible thing to have to deal with at a time like this. But somebody has to be the responsible one. He said it gently, sadly, like a burden he was nobly shouldering, and I stood there in the ashes of the house I had built to keep my daughter safe. And three pieces clicked together in my mind with the awful precision of a circuit completing. A fire that could not have started on its own. A husband who arrived with dry eyes. And a man on the phone, hours after his wife was carried unconscious from the flames, already asking how fast he could collect the money. I said nothing. I had learned my lesson in the hospital hallway. I just looked at him, and I nodded slowly, and I let him believe I was too broken to understand. But I understood everything now. Or almost everything. There was only one thing left to do before I could be sure. I had to go back into that house, alone, and read the fire myself. I waited until the investigators were gone, and the light had gone soft and low before I went back. I parked down the street and walked up in the cold dusk, my flashlight heavy in my coat pocket. The yellow tape still ringed the property, but there was no one to stop me now. I stood at the edge of the ruined yard for a long moment, looking at the black shell of the house, and before I stepped inside, I let myself remember. 2 years ago, this had been the proudest job of my life. Adeline had been so happy when she bought the place. It was old and tired, but it had good bones, she said. The way she always talked about things. Like a house was a living thing you could nurse back to health. The first thing I did, before she ever moved a stick of furniture in, was open up the walls and look at the wiring. What I found made my blood run cold, even then. Old aluminum branch wiring from the 60s, the kind that loosens and overheats at the connections, the kind that has burned down more homes than anyone will ever count. I told her I would not let her sleep one night in that house until it was fixed. She had laughed at me and called me overprotective, and I told her that being overprotective was the entire job description of a father and an electrician both. We had argued about the cost. I paid for most of it myself, and never told her how much. It did not matter. There was no price on the thing I was buying, which was the certainty that my child could close her eyes at night under a roof that would not turn on her. So I fixed it. I spent 3 weeks there. I pulled every foot of that old aluminum out and ran new copper to every box. I put in a new service panel with my own hands, mounted it on the exterior wall, labeled every breaker in clean block letters so that anyone, even a frightened person in the dark, could find the right switch. I installed arc fault breakers, the kind designed specifically to sense the tiny dangerous sparks that start electrical fires and cut the power before a flame can ever catch. I put them on every circuit in the house, every single one. That is the detail I kept turning over in my mind as I stood there. Arc fault protection on every circuit. If a wire in that house had begun to arc, the way Kenzo Mata claimed, the breaker would have tripped and killed the power long before anything caught fire. That is what those breakers are for. That is the entire reason they exist. For the fire to have started the way he said. 3 or 4 separate safety systems would all have had to fail at the exact same moment, in the exact same place. On the one night, my daughter happened to be home alone, and her husband happened to be 3 states away. I had testified in court cases before, on behalf of insurers and against them, explaining to juries how a fire reveals its own history. I had taught younger men to read the same signs. I knew, with the certainty of 40 years, that what I was being told had happened simply could not have happened, and a lie that large is never told by accident. Someone builds a lie like that on purpose, brick by brick, the same way I build everything else. Electricity does not work like that. It does not conspire. It is the most honest force I have ever known. It follows its laws every time. And when something goes wrong, it leaves a clear and readable trail back to the cause. The only way to get the impossible chain of failures Mata described was for a human hand to arrange them. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped through the gap where the front door used to be. Inside, the destruction was total. But to a trained eye, even total destruction has a shape. I moved slowly, the way I had moved through 1,000 buildings, reading the story the fire had left behind. The char on the walls was deepest and lowest in the front living room, near the center of the floor. That alone made the hair on my neck stand up. Electrical fires start where the electricity is, inside walls, near outlets and boxes and the panel. They do not start in the open middle of a room, far from any wiring at all. I crouched down and ran my flashlight across the floor. The wood was burned through in a pattern I had seen before, in training, in case studies, but never with my own daughter's name attached to it. It was not the random, uneven charring of a fire that spread on its own. It was lower in some places and higher in others, in a way that made no natural sense. Pooled, almost, as though the fire had followed the shape of something spilled across the floorboards. I knelt there in the ash and the cold, and I lowered my face close to the burned wood, and I breathed in. Underneath the smell of char, faint but unmistakable, was that same sharp chemical odor. My hand was steady when I lifted my flashlight again, but something inside me was not. Because I was kneeling in the exact center of a room that held no outlet, no box, no wire of any kind, staring at the deepest burn in the entire house. This was the origin. This was where the fire began, and there was nothing here. Nothing of mine. Nothing electrical at all. Whatever had started this fire had been brought into this room and set down in the middle of the floor, far from anything I had ever installed. In the one spot where no honest accident could ever have begun. I stayed there on my knees for a long time, an old man alone in the dark with a flashlight, and I let the truth settle into me, cold and complete. I did not trust myself. That is a hard thing for a man to admit. But it is the truth. Kneeling there in the ash, I knew what I was seeing. But I also knew I was a father whose daughter lay unconscious in a hospital bed. A man with every reason in the world to see a crime where there might only be a tragedy. Grief can make you read a story into anything. I had spent my whole career warning younger men against exactly that, against finding the answer they wanted instead of the answer the evidence gave them. So before I let myself believe it, I needed someone with no reason to lie to me to look at the same floor and tell me what he saw. There was only one man I trusted for that. I called Lucas Nolan from my truck, sitting in the dark outside the burned house. Lucas and I went back almost 30 years. He had spent his whole career as a fire investigator for the marshal's office. The real thing. The kind of man who could stand in a gutted building and tell you not just where a fire started, but what it had for breakfast. We had worked the same cases from opposite sides more than once, him reading the burn and me reading the wiring. And we had built the kind of respect that only comes from years of watching another man do hard work honestly. He had retired a few years before me. When he answered the phone, his voice was rough with sleep, and it took me a moment to get the words out. "Lucas, it's Sullivan. I need you to come look at something. And I need you to tell me I'm wrong." He came the next morning at first light. He did not ask many questions on the phone. He just heard something in my voice and said he would be there. I watched him work, and it was a different thing entirely from what Kenzo Mata had done. Lucas moved through that house like a man in church. He spent the first 10 minutes just standing in the doorway, looking, before he ever touched anything. Then he went in slow. He read the walls. He read the studs. He got down on his hands and knees in the center of the living room, in the same spot where I had knelt. And he stayed there a long time without saying a word, his face an inch from the burned floor. When he finally stood up, his knees cracking, his expression was grim in a way I had never seen on him in 30 years. "Sullivan," he said quietly. "Who told you this was electrical?" "A private investigator, hired by the insurance company. Name of Kenzo Mata." Lucas was silent for a moment. Then he pointed at the floor. "You see that pattern, that pour pattern, the way the char follows those lines across the boards and pools, low right here in the center. That is not how a building burns. That is how a liquid burns. Somebody walked into this room and poured an accelerant across this floor in a deliberate trail and put a flame to it." He looked up at me. "And the origin is dead center, away from every wall, away from any outlet. There is no ignition source here. None. A fire does not start in the middle of an empty floor by itself. Sullivan, it can't. Something has to start it." I made myself ask, could it have been electrical? Any chance at all? An arc, a fault, anything. He almost laughed. But there was no humor in it. "From where there's no wiring within 10 feet of the origin, and you told me yourself you put arc fault breakers on every circuit in this house. Even if a wire had somehow faulted, those breakers would have killed it." "No." He shook his head slowly. "I'd stake my entire career on it. This fire was set. This is arson. Whoever wrote that electrical report either never did the work, or they did it and lied." He said the word, and it landed in the cold morning air and stayed there. Arson. I had known it. I had felt it standing in front of the flames 2 nights before, when every instinct I owned told me the fire had no business existing. I had read it myself in the burn patterns. But hearing Lucas say it out loud, a man with no reason on earth to lie to me, a man who had just told me to my face that I might be wrong and then found that I was right, made it real in a way my own certainty never could have. Someone had walked into my daughter's home, into the house I built with my own 2 hands to keep her safe, and they had poured fire across her floor on purpose, and my daughter had been inside it. I stood there in the ruins, and the grief I had been holding back since the night of the fire finally turned into something else. It did not explode. It did not roar. It hardened. It cured. The way concrete cures, from something soft and shapeless into something that would never move again. The man who walked into that house had made one mistake he could not have known about. He had set his fire inside the one building in the world whose every wire, every box, every breaker was known intimately by a man who had spent 40 years learning to read exactly the kind of lie that fire leaves behind. "Lucas," I said. My voice was very steady now. "I'm not going to be able to leave this alone." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded. Slowly. The way a man nods when he has already decided to follow you into something dark. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would. A fire tells you what happened. It does not tell you why." I had the what now. I knew, with Lucas standing beside me as my witness, that someone had set that fire on purpose. But knowing a crime was committed is not the same as knowing who committed it. And a man my age has learned that you do not accuse anyone of anything until you can trace the whole circuit, from the source all the way to the thing it powers. In my trade, when something burns out, you do not just replace the part that failed. You ask what made it fail. You follow the current back, connection by connection, until you find the true cause. Because if you only fix the symptom, the fault is still there. waiting to burn again. My father taught me that, long before I ever held a license. He was a lineman, and he used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world is a problem you have only half understood, because you will walk away thinking you are safe when you are not. I had built my whole life on finishing the trace. I was not about to stop short now, not with Adeline's life on the line. So the morning after Lucas confirmed it, I went to see Alan Jimenez. Alan had been my family's attorney for 20 years. He had drawn up the papers when I sold my company. He had handled Elizabeth's estate after she passed, and he was the one who had helped her set up the trust for Adeline before the cancer took her. He was a careful man, soft-spoken, with reading glasses always pushed up on his forehead and a memory for detail that had saved me more than once. If anyone could tell me where the money in this family flowed, it was Alan. I sat across from him in his quiet office, and I told him everything. The fire that burned wrong, the dry-eyed husband, the investigator who would not investigate, and the phone call I overheard in the driveway. Evan asking how fast the insurance could pay out, talking about Adeline's inheritance as though it had already become his. Alan listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he got up, went to his filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. "Sullivan," he said, "I want to show you something, and I want you to understand. I am bending some rules to do it, because I believe you, and because Adeline is the closest thing I have to a goddaughter." He laid the folder on the desk. "After you called me last night, I made some inquiries. Evan's name is on a number of business filings around the county. Real estate development, mostly. Shopping plazas. A condominium project out by the highway. He always told us business was good," I said. Alan's mouth tightened. "Business has not been good. Business has been a catastrophe." He opened the folder and turned it toward me. "The condominium project collapsed 8 months ago. He had personal guarantees on the loans." "Sullivan, that means when the project failed, the debt did not disappear. It followed him home, from what I can piece together. He owes well over $2 million to lenders who are not the patient kind. There are liens. There is at least one lawsuit. A man in his position is weeks, maybe days, from losing everything he owns." I sat very still and let the numbers arrange themselves in my mind. The way I used to read a load calculation. $2 million in debt. A wife with an inheritance. A house with an insurance policy. "How much," I asked, "is in Adeline's trust?" Alan took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. And when he answered, his voice was heavy. "Elizabeth left her a little over $3 million. It matured on Adeline's last birthday. As of 2 months ago, that money became fully accessible to her. 2 months ago, I felt the cold settle in again. And the house, the insurance, a homeowner's policy with a substantial dwelling and contents payout. And," he paused, "there is also a life insurance policy on Adeline. Evan is the beneficiary. He increased the coverage about a year ago, significantly." The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear traffic, ordinary people driving to ordinary days. Inside, I was looking at the shape of a man drowning, $2 million in debt that would ruin him, and within his reach, if only certain things happened. More than $3 million in a trust, a fat insurance payout on a burned house, and a life insurance policy that paid out if his wife simply did not survive. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I spent my career trusting numbers and materials precisely because they could be trusted. Because copper does what copper does, and a rated breaker holds to its rating. People were harder, but even I could see that no honest accident would ever line up this neatly. When every wire in a panel runs to the same hidden junction, you stop calling it coincidence and you start calling it a design. A man drowning will grab at anything to pull himself up, even if what he grabs is another person, and he has to push them under to do it. There's something else, Alan said slowly, watching my face. And this is why I called you in instead of telling you over the phone. 3 weeks ago, before the fire, Adeline came to see me, alone. She didn't make an appointment. She just showed up. My heart climbed into my throat. What did she want? She asked me, Alan said, how she could protect her trust so that her husband could never touch it. And she asked me what she would need to do to file for divorce. I did not sleep that night either. Adeline had come to Alan 3 weeks before the fire. She had asked how to protect her trust and how to leave her husband. And 3 weeks later, her house burned down around her with her inside it. I am an old man who has spent his life refusing to believe in coincidence. And this was not a coincidence. This was cause and effect. This was a circuit. And I was finally beginning to see the shape of it, but I still did not understand the whole of it. A man with $2 million in debt has a reason to want money. I understood that part. What I didn't understand yet was the timing, and the cruelty of it, and the strange completeness of the plan. Setting a fire to collect insurance is the act of a desperate man. Setting a fire while your wife is inside the house is something else entirely. That is not desperation. That is intention. And intention always has more than one wire feeding it. So I kept following the current. Lucas had spent 30 years learning how to pull records, and Alan knew which doors to knock on, between the two of them, and an old contractor who still had friends at half the permit offices in the county. We began to assemble the picture of Evan Ellison's life over the last year, not the polished version he sold at family dinners, but the real one, the one written in filings and statements, and the small public traces a person leaves behind without meaning to. The debt was worse than Alan had first thought. But that was not what stopped me. What stopped me was a name. It appeared first on a lease. 11 months ago. Evan had co-signed a lease on an apartment across town, a nice building near the river, far from the home he shared with my daughter. The lease was not in his name alone. It was shared with a woman, Raina Ballard. I had never heard the name in my life. I might have dismissed it. A business associate, maybe. An office he rented. But then the name appeared again. A car. Leased 8 months ago. The payments running through one of Evan's failing companies. Registered to Raina Ballard. And again. A credit account. And again. A hotel folio that Lucas turned up. A weekend at a resort 2 hours north. 8 months back. 1 room. 2 names. I sat at Alan's conference table with these papers spread out in front of me, and I looked at that name appearing over and over in the private architecture of Evan's life, and a different kind of cold went through me. This was not the cold of arithmetic, of debts and trusts and payouts. This was older and uglier. Lucas was watching me. "You know who she is?" "No," I said. "But Evan does. He's known her for almost a year. He's been paying for her car. He signed a lease with her." I tapped the hotel folio. "And he's been taking her places he never took my daughter." Alan leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Sullivan, I don't want to get ahead of the evidence. We don't know what this is yet." "No," I agreed. "We don't, but I think we both did. We just did not want to say it out loud in that quiet room, because saying it would make it true. And the truth was going to break my daughter's heart in a way the fire never could. The fire had only burned her house. This would burn something deeper. I gathered the papers slowly and squared their edges. The way I have always done when my hands need something to do while my mind works. The shape of the circuit was almost complete now. A drowning man, a mountain of debt, a wife with money he could not legally touch as long as she was well and conscious and able to say no. A wife who, 3 weeks before the fire, had walked into a lawyer's office and asked how to take that money out of his reach forever. And now, threaded through all of it, a second woman, hidden for nearly a year behind leases and car payments, and a hotel room 2 hours from home. I did not have proof of what connected them. Not yet. A man can have debts and a girlfriend, and still be merely a liar and a cheat. Not a killer. The law would want more than a name on a lease. The law would want certainty. So would I. There was only one way to get it. I could not ask Evan. I could not subpoena him. But I could do what I had done my whole life when I needed to understand how something really worked. I could watch it carry its load. I could observe the thing in operation, quietly, from a distance, until it showed me its true function. I had to find Raina Ballard, and I had to see the two of them together, with my own eyes, before I let myself believe what every instinct I owned was already telling me. I wrote the address from the lease on a slip of paper and put it in my coat pocket. That night, for the first time in my 67 years, I sat in my truck in the dark outside a stranger's building, and I waited. I sat in my truck for 3 nights before I saw them. The first 2 nights, nothing. Lights in windows, strangers coming and going, an old man growing stiff in the cold, second-guessing himself, wondering if he had finally crossed the line from grief into something worse. I almost gave it up. On the 3rd night, I told myself, I would go home and leave the watching to Lucas, who was younger and better at it than I was. Then, on the 3rd night, Evan's car pulled into the lot. I knew it the moment the headlights swung across the building. I had ridden in that car. I had sat in the back of it at Adeline's wedding, watching the back of his head, telling myself to trust the man my daughter had chosen. He parked, and he got out. And he did not look like a man whose wife was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. He looked relaxed. He moved easily, unhurried, a paper bag of takeout in one hand. The way a man moves when he is coming home. He had a key. He let himself in without knocking. I sat there with my hands on the wheel. And I waited. And I watched the windows. A few minutes later, a light came on in a 3rd-floor apartment, and through the gap in the curtains, I saw them. I saw a woman cross the room toward him, young, dark-haired, maybe 30. She took the bag from his hand and set it down, and then she put her arms around his neck, and he pulled her in, and he kissed her the way a man kisses someone he has kissed 1,000 times before. There was nothing furtive about it, nothing new or nervous. It was easy and familiar and at home, and that was the thing that broke something in me. It was not a single mistake. It was a life. He had built a whole second life in that apartment across town, while my daughter planted gardens and trusted him and signed her name next to his. And then she turned, and the light caught her side on, and I saw it. She was pregnant. Well along. 5 or 6 months at least. Her hand resting on the curve of it, the way expectant mothers do without even thinking. And Evan put his hand there too, over hers, and leaned his forehead down against her hair. And for a moment, the two of them just stood there in the warm yellow light, a man and a woman, and the child they were waiting for, like the photograph of a happy family. I do not know how long I sat in the dark watching, long enough for the takeout to be eaten. Probably. Long enough for the cold to seep all the way into my bones. I could not move. I could not look away. My daughter was lying in a coma with smoke-scarred lungs and a wound on her head that no one could explain. And the man who had vowed to protect her was standing in a window, across town, with his hand on another woman's belly. When I finally drove home, I did not feel the rage I expected. The rage came later, in waves, for weeks. What I felt in that moment was something colder and more terrible, because in that moment, I finally understood the why I had been chasing. I understood the whole circuit at last, every wire in it, and the understanding sat in my stomach like a stone. I had thought, up until that night, that this was about money, that Evan was a drowning man who had set a fire to grab at his wife's fortune, and that Adeline being inside was a horror he had been willing to risk. A monstrous thing, but a comprehensible one. Greed I could understand. This was worse. A man drowning in debt, with a pregnant mistress in an apartment across town, and a fortune just out of his reach. A wife he no longer wanted, who had 3 weeks earlier walked into a lawyer's office to lock that fortune away from him and to leave him. If Adeline divorced him, he got nothing. The trust would be protected. He would lose her money, lose the house, lose everything, and be left with $2 million in debt, a ruined career, and a child on the way he could not afford. But if Adeline simply did not survive a tragic accident, everything changed. The life insurance paid out, the house insurance paid out, and as her grieving widower, he stood to inherit the trust she had not yet managed to protect. $3 million, free and clear, enough to erase the debt and start a new life in that warm yellow apartment with the woman and the child who were waiting for him. My daughter was not the target of a robbery. She was the obstacle. She was the one wire standing between Evan Ellison and everything he wanted. And so he had decided, coldly and deliberately, to cut her out of the circuit entirely. He had not set that fire to take what was hers. He had set it to be rid of her. I parked in my driveway and sat there a long time with the engine ticking as it cooled. An old man alone in the dark. And I made my daughter a promise she could not hear. I told her I knew now. I told her I understood everything. And I told her that the man who did this had made one mistake he would never recover from. He thought he had gotten away with it. There is a thing that happens to a man when he learns that someone has tried to murder his child. It does not feel the way you would imagine. I had expected fury, and the fury came. But underneath it was something I had not expected at all. It was a kind of madness, quiet and patient and very dark, that whispered to me in the small hours of the morning and told me exactly how simple it would be to end this. I knew where Evan slept now. I knew the apartment, the floor, the window with the gap in the curtains. I was an old man, but I was not a weak one. 40 years of pulling wire and climbing ladders and hauling conduit had left me with hands that could still close around a throat. I had a truck and a long, quiet drive in the dark, and nothing left to lose but a daughter who was already half gone from me. For 3 nights after I saw them in that window, I lay awake in my recliner and I let myself imagine it. I imagined walking up those stairs. I imagined the look on his face. I am not proud of those nights, but I will not lie to you about them either, because a man who tells you he never thought about it is a man who never really loved anyone. What pulled me back was Elizabeth. My wife had been gone almost 5 years, and there were still mornings I reached across the bed for her before I remembered. She had been the wisest person I ever knew, wiser than me by a long way, though I never told her so often enough. And in those dark nights I found myself talking to her the way I had not done since the funeral, asking her what I should do, and slowly, the way her voice always did. The answer came to me. She would not have wanted me to become the thing that took her daughter. Elizabeth used to say that anyone can be destroyed by a person willing to throw their own life away, and that the truly hard thing, the only thing that ever really wins, is to defeat a liar without becoming one. If I went to that apartment and did what the dark voice wanted, I would feel justice for about as long as it took the police to arrive. Then I would spend my last years in a cell. Evan would be dead, and beyond any real reckoning. Raina would be a grieving victim. And Adeline, if she ever woke up, would wake to find that she had lost her father along with everything else. The fortune Elizabeth left her would be tangled in the courts for a decade. Evan's lie about the electrical fire would stand forever, because the one man who could disprove it would be locked away as a murderer. That is what he wanted. I realized, not consciously. Maybe. But a man like Evan was counting on exactly that. He was counting on me being what he assumed I was, an old fool, too emotional to think, who would either fade quietly into grief or explode into something stupid and self-destructive. Either way, I would be out of his path. Either way, the lie would hold. The most powerful thing I could do was the one thing he would never expect. Nothing rash, nothing loud. I would not give him the violent, broken old man he was counting on. I would give him the patient one instead. I had spent my entire life proving that the truth is not a matter of opinion. A circuit either works or it does not. A connection is either sound or it is not. You cannot argue a fire into having started somewhere it did not start. The physical world keeps its own honest record, and no amount of charm or money or forged paperwork can change what actually happened inside those walls. Evan had built his whole plan on the belief that a confident lie, backed by a paid investigator and a sympathetic story, would become the truth simply because no one with the knowledge to challenge it would bother to look. He had not counted on me looking, and he had not counted on what I would find. So I made my choice. I would not touch him. I would do something far worse to a man like that. I would prove, beyond any possibility of doubt, exactly what he had done, and I would do it so completely that no lawyer, no judge, no jury, no paid expert in the world could explain it away. I would take the fire he set to bury the truth, and I would use that same fire to light the path straight back to him. But to do that, I needed more than a burn pattern and a name on a lease. I needed to know what Adeline had known. She had walked into Alan's office 3 weeks before the fire, frightened enough to ask about divorce and about protecting her money. That meant she had seen something. She had learned something. My daughter was careful and methodical, my own child in that way. And if she had discovered her husband's betrayal, she would not have simply carried it in her head. She would have kept a record, and I knew exactly where she would have kept it. Not in the house, where Evan could find it. She would have kept it in the one place in the world that was hers alone. The place she had built with her own hands the way I had built her home with mine. Her greenhouse. The next morning, I drove out to my daughter's nursery to find what she had hidden there. My daughter's nursery sat at the end of a gravel road, on the south edge of town. 3 long greenhouses and a little office, surrounded by fields she had slowly been turning back into something living. She had started the business 6 years ago with almost nothing, the same way I had started mine. I used to tease her that she had my stubbornness and her mother's green thumb, and that between the two she had built something neither of us could have managed alone. She grew native plants, the kind that belonged in Ohio soil, and she designed gardens for people who wanted their land to look the way it had before anyone built on it. It was good work, honest work. You could not fake a garden any more than you could fake a circuit. Either the thing grew or it did not. I let myself in with the spare key she had given me years ago. It was early, and the place was empty. Her one part-time helper not due in until later. The greenhouses were warm and damp and green, full of the smell of soil and growing things, and walking through them nearly undid me. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence of her. Her handwriting on the little plant markers, her gloves left on a workbench, her travel mug still sitting where she had set it down the morning before her world ended. She had been here. She had stood in this exact spot, alive and whole and afraid, planning her escape from a man who was already planning her death. I went into the little office at the back. If she had kept anything, it would be here, in the one place that was hers and hers alone. The place her husband never came because he had no interest in dirt and seedlings and the slow, patient work of growing things. I am a methodical man. I searched the way I would inspect a building, top to bottom, left to right, missing nothing. Her desk drawers held what you would expect: invoices, seed catalogs, a folder of garden designs. I went through all of it twice. Nothing, but I knew my daughter. She was careful. The way I am careful. If she was frightened enough of her husband to ask a lawyer about divorce, she was frightened enough to hide whatever she had found, somewhere he would never think to look. Somewhere that meant something only to her. I stopped searching the obvious places, and I stood in the middle of that little office, and I asked myself where I would hide something. Not in a drawer, not in a file. Somewhere that looked like nothing. Somewhere that belonged. My eyes settled on the row of clay pots along the windowsill above her desk. Most held small plants, but one, at the end, held only soil, dark and undisturbed, with nothing growing in it. A potter as careful as my daughter does not leave a pot full of soil with nothing planted in it. It was wrong. The way Evan's dry eyes had been wrong. A small detail out of place in an otherwise ordered world. I lifted the pot down and set it on the desk and pushed my fingers into the cool soil. About 2 inches down, they touched something hard and flat, wrapped in plastic. I drew it out slowly and brushed the dirt away. It was a small zippered freezer bag, the kind from any kitchen drawer, and inside it were 2 things. A USB drive, black one, ordinary, the kind you buy 10 to a pack, and folded around it, a single sheet of paper. My daughter's handwriting filling both sides. My hands were not quite steady as I unfolded it. At the top of the page, underlined, twice, she had written 4 words that stopped my heart. If anything happens to me, I had to sit down. I lowered myself into her desk chair, the cheap one with the squeaky wheel she always meant to replace, and I held that page in the warm green light of the greenhouse, and I made myself read it. She had known. That was the thing that broke me. Sitting there, she had known she was in danger. Not vaguely, not as a fear, but clearly enough that she had written those 4 words at the top of a page and hidden it in a pot of soil where only someone who truly knew her would ever think to look. She had been afraid for her life. My careful, methodical girl. And she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had kept a record. She had built her case the way her father would have, brick by brick. And she had left it where she prayed someone would find it. She had been reaching out to me in the only way she could, weeks before the fire. And I had not known. I had been at home, sleeping in my recliner, while my daughter buried a warning in the dark and prayed it would not be needed. I sat in that chair for a long moment, holding the page, not yet able to read past those 4 words. Then I steadied my hands, and I turned my eyes to the first line of what my daughter had written, and I began to read what she had discovered. My daughter had beautiful handwriting, even now, even in fear. The letters were neat and even, the way her mother's had been. I read every word, and I will carry some of them with me to my grave. She wrote that it had started small, a change in Evan, late nights he could not account for, a coldness where there had once been at least the appearance of warmth. She had not wanted to believe it. She wrote, and she had spent months telling herself she was imagining things. I understood that better than she could have known. I had spent the first nights after the fire telling myself the very same thing. Then she had found the apartment, a credit card statement, left out by mistake, with a charge from a furniture store and a delivery address that was not their home. She had driven there. She had sat outside, the way I would later sit outside. And she had seen Raina Ballard. She had learned the woman's name. And over the following weeks, my careful girl had done exactly what I would have done. She had started gathering proof. She had photographed documents. She had saved statements. She had pulled together a record of her husband's debts, his failing companies, the money he was bleeding, and the second life he was funding while she paid the mortgage on the house her father wired. Everything was on the drive. She wrote the photographs, the financial records, the lease with the woman's name on it. Proof of all of it. And then came the part that stopped my breath. She wrote that she had confronted him, not in anger, she said, because she was past anger by then. She had simply told him, calmly, that she knew about Raina, about the pregnancy, which she had figured out on her own, about the money. She told him she was filing for divorce, that she had already spoken to a lawyer about protecting her inheritance, and that he would not see a single dollar of her mother's money. She wrote that she had expected him to rage, or to beg, or to lie. Instead, she wrote, he had gone very calm, and the calmness had frightened her more than any shouting ever could. He had looked at her. She wrote, the way a man looks at a problem he is deciding how to solve. And that was the night she came home and wrote this letter and buried it in the soil. Because for the first time in her marriage, she had looked at her husband and understood that he might be capable of anything if anything happens to me. She had written at the top. She had not written if I leave him, or if we divorce. She had written if anything happens to me. She had known, in her bones. She had known what kind of man she was dealing with. And she had been right. I sat in that squeaky chair in the warm green light, and I finally understood the full and terrible shape of what had been done. This was never just about money. I had thought, even after I saw Raina in that window, that the fire was a desperate man's grab at a fortune. But it was colder and more deliberate than that. Adeline had backed Evan into a corner. She knew everything. She had the proof, sitting right here on this drive, and she was about to use it to divorce him and lock her $3 million away, where his creditors and his mistress would never reach it. The moment those divorce papers were filed, Evan was finished, bankrupt, exposed, ruined. She was not an obstacle to his plan. She was a witness to it. And worse than a witness, she was the one person alive with the evidence and the motive to destroy him. So he did not wait for the divorce. He could not. He set the fire to do two things at once: to collect the insurance and the inheritance that came to a grieving widower, and to silence the only witness who could ever prove what he was. Before she could open her mouth in a courtroom, he had not even waited for her to be away from the house. Her being inside was not a risk he was reluctantly taking. It was the entire point. He tried to burn my daughter alive to keep her quiet, and it had so very nearly worked. If the head injury had been an inch deeper, if the smoke had filled her lungs a few minutes longer, if a neighbor named Skylar had not happened to wake and smell smoke and call me, Adeline would be dead, her warning rotting unread in a pot of soil, and Evan would be collecting his money and raising his child in that warm apartment, mourning his poor, unstable wife, who died in a tragic electrical fire. I lowered the page to my lap. My girl had tried to warn me 3 weeks before any of this. She had sat in this chair and written these words and prayed I would never have to read them. And I hadn't known. I had not seen her fear, had not heard whatever was unsaid in her voice the last few times we spoke. I had been her father for 34 years, and in the moment she needed me most, I had been asleep in my recliner with the television on. I am not a man who weeps easily, but I wept then, alone in my daughter's greenhouse, holding her brave and frightened handwriting in my hands. Then I wiped my face, and I put the page and the drive carefully back into the plastic bag, and I stood up. The grief could wait. My daughter had built her case before they took her. Now it was my turn to finish it. I drove from the greenhouse straight to the hospital, the plastic bag with my daughter's letter, and drive zipped safely into the inside pocket of my coat. Over my heart, I knew Evan had blocked me from her medical decisions, but he had not. It turned out, been able to keep a father from sitting at his daughter's bedside. Not entirely. Not without making a scene that would have raised the very questions he most wanted buried. So during the quiet hours, when he was not there, the nurses let me in, and I had come to understand, over those first terrible days, that one nurse in particular made sure I got more time than the rules strictly allowed. Harper Vang was working when I arrived. She was the young nurse who had given me that small, knowing nod the first morning. The one who had watched Evan the way I had watched him. She met me in the corridor outside the intensive care unit, and she glanced both ways down the hall before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was low. "He was here this morning," she said. "Your son-in-law. He spent about 10 minutes with her." She paused. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't talk to her. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he looked at her monitors. The whole time, like he was checking on something. The cold came back into my chest. I knew exactly what he had been checking. He had been checking whether his wife was going to live or die, whether the problem he thought he had solved was going to solve itself, or whether he would have to finish what the fire had started. "Miss Vang," I said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" She looked at me for a long moment, deciding. The way I had decided whether to trust Alan, whether to call Lucas. "Because I've been a nurse for 9 years," she said, "and I've seen grief, real grief, on the worst days of people's lives. I know what it looks like." Her jaw tightened. "And whatever that man is, he isn't grieving. I don't know what's going on with your family, Mr. Compton, but that woman in there is my patient. And something about this is wrong. And I am not going to stand by and pretend I don't see it. I am not too proud to tell you that my eyes stung after days of being treated as a broken old fool, of fighting alone against charm and money and forged paperwork. Here was a stranger, half my age, who had simply looked and seen and refused to look away. "Something is very wrong," I told her, "and I am going to need your help to keep her safe." I did not tell her everything. Not yet. But I told her enough. I told her I had reason to believe the fire had not been an accident, and that the person responsible was someone who had every reason to want my daughter never to wake up. I watched the understanding settle over her face, the horror of it. And then, beneath the horror, a hardening that I recognized, because I had felt it harden in myself. "If he comes again," she said quietly, "I'll know. We watch our patients, Mr. Compton, more than people think. If anything changes with her medications, with her chart, with her care, anything that isn't ordered by her doctors for her own good, I will know about it, and I will make sure there's a record." She nodded once, firmly. "She won't be alone in there, not on my shifts." Then she let me in to see her. Adeline lay in the dim room, the machines breathing for her in their slow, patient rhythm. and I sat down in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. It was warm. I held it in both of mine the way I had held it on the stretcher the night of the fire, the way I had held it when she was a baby, small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I leaned close to her ear, and I spoke to her, even though they told me she could not hear. I told her I had found her letter. I told her I had been so proud and so heartbroken, both at once, that she had been brave enough and smart enough to leave it. I told her I was sorry, more sorry than I had words for, that I had not seen her fear in time, that she had had to face this alone. And then I made her a promise, the way I had made promises to her mother in another hospital room years before. I told her that the man who did this would never touch her again, that I knew everything now, and that I was not going to fade away, and I was not going to lose my temper and ruin it. I told her I was going to do this the right way, the careful way, the way that would hold. I told her to rest, and to fight, and to come back to me, because there was a great deal of work I needed her help to finish, and a garden somewhere that needed her hands. I do not know if she heard me, but as I sat there holding her hand, I felt the smallest thing, a faint pressure, the barest squeeze of her fingers against mine. There and gone so fast, I could not be sure I had not imagined it. I sat very still, my heart pounding, and I waited to feel it again, whether I had imagined it or not. It changed something in me. My daughter was still in there. She was still fighting, and that meant I had no time to waste. I had her letter. I had her drive. I had Lucas, and Alan, and now Harper Vang. It was time to take everything we had and build it into something no liar could ever knock down. It was time to close the circuit. I had spent 40 years learning that being right is not enough. You can know, with absolute certainty, that a building has a fatal flaw. You can see it in the numbers, feel it in your bones. But until you can prove it to the man who signs the checks, in language he cannot argue with, the building gets built anyway, and people get hurt. The truth needs more than a witness. It needs to be made undeniable. It needs to be assembled, piece by piece, into something solid enough to stand up in front of people whose whole job is to look for the weak point and pull it apart. So I did not go to the police. Not yet. A grieving father walking into a station with a theory about his son-in-law would get a sympathetic nod and a closed file. I had a paid investigator's report on record saying the fire was electrical. I had my own word against it, and the word of a retired fire investigator who was my old friend, which any defense lawyer would tear apart in a sentence. Bias, they would say. The old man is grieving. His friend is doing him a favor. It would not be enough. I needed someone with a reason of their own to want the truth, and I knew exactly where to find a man like that. Insurance companies do not like paying out millions of dollars. When a claim is large enough and strange enough, they send their own people, special investigators whose entire job is to find fraud, a policy on a burned house, a separate policy on the life of the woman inside it, a beneficiary drowning in debt. That is the kind of thing that makes an insurance company nervous. So I found out who was handling the claim, and I learned his name, Johann Martinez, and I asked Alan to arrange a meeting. Martinez was a compact, careful man in his 50s, with the flat, watchful eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 30 years and had stopped expecting anything else. When I sat down across from him, I understood immediately that he did not see a grieving father. He saw a possible angle, and it took me a moment to realize, with a jolt, what that angle was. He thought it might be me. "Mr. Compton," he said, folding his hands on the table. "You wired the house yourself. Is that right?" I did. "So if there were a defect in that wiring, an electrical fire, that would be your responsibility. Your liability. He let that sit. And now here you are, very eager to convince everyone the fire wasn't electrical at all. You can see how that looks from where I sit. I will be honest. For a moment, the unfairness of it took my breath away. But then the cold, logical part of me took over. The part that had argued with building inspectors for 4 decades. And I understood that his suspicion was not an insult. It was exactly what I needed. A man this suspicious would not take anyone's word for anything. He would only believe the evidence. And the evidence was on my side. "Mr. Martinez," I said, "you think I might be steering you away from an electrical cause to protect myself from a liability claim. That is a reasonable thing to suspect, and I respect you for saying it to my face. So let me make you an offer. Don't take my word for anything. Don't take my friend's word. Look at the house yourself. Bring your own expert. Test the debris from the point of origin for accelerants. If it comes back clean, if there's no chemical there, then I'm wrong, and you can pursue me all you like. But if it comes back the way I know it will, then you and I want exactly the same thing." That got his attention. A man steering him toward a lie would never invite an independent test. He studied me for a long moment. "You sound very sure," he said. "I am sure," I said, "because I have read that floor with my own eyes, and I have spent my life reading what fire and electricity leave behind. There is a pour pattern in the center of that living room, dead center, 10 feet from the nearest wire. Your own expert will see it the second he kneels down, and the lab will find a petroleum accelerant in those floorboards, because somebody poured it there. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to test it." Martinez did not answer right away. He looked down at the file in front of him, at the photographs, at the strange, clean report from Kenzo Mata that had landed too fast and concluded too neatly. I watched something shift behind his careful eyes. A professional who has been lied to for 30 years also develops a nose for when something is too smooth, too convenient, the way Mata's report had been. "All right," he said finally. He pulled a legal pad toward him and uncapped his pen. "I'll send my own investigator, independent lab, full accelerant panel on the origin samples." He looked up at me. "But understand me, Mr. Compton. I follow this wherever it goes. If it points at you, I will not hesitate. I would not respect you if you did." I said, "Point it wherever the evidence sends you. I am only asking you to actually look. That is more than anyone else has done." He almost smiled. It did not quite reach his eyes, but it was something. He had come into that room hunting a liar. He was beginning to suspect he had found an honest man instead, and that the lie was somewhere else entirely. A week later, his independent lab results came back, and everything changed. The lab report ran 4 pages, but the only line that mattered was near the top. Samples taken from the point of origin in the living room had tested positive for a medium petroleum distillate. In plain language, for a jury, for a judge, for anyone, somebody had poured a flammable liquid across that floor. Charcoal lighter fluid, most likely. The kind sold in any hardware store in the county. The lab had found it soaked deep into the floorboards in the exact center of the room, 10 feet from the nearest wire. Precisely where Lucas and I had said it would be. It was no longer my word. It was no longer an old man's grief or a friend's favor. It was a number on a page from an independent laboratory, with no stake in my family. Commissioned by an insurance investigator who had walked into our first meeting, suspecting me. Johan Martinez called me himself to read me the result, and his voice had changed. The flat suspicion was gone. In its place was something harder and more focused. "There's no accidental explanation for this, Mr. Compton," he said. "None. You don't get a petroleum distillate pooled in the center of a room by accident. This fire was set. A pause. I owe you an apology. I came at you hard. And you were right. You did your job, I told him. That's all I ever wanted anyone to do. Now that he believed. Martinez moved like the professional he was. And the first thing his belief did was turn his attention to Kenzo Mata. Because here was the question that hung over everything. Mata was a trained fire investigator. The pour pattern in that living room was so obvious that Lucas had spotted it from the doorway. And Martinez's own expert confirmed it in 20 minutes. There was no way a competent investigator could have stood in that room and honestly concluded the fire was electrical, which meant one of two things. Either Kenzo Mata was incompetent beyond belief, or he had been paid to look the other way. Martinez had the resources to find out which. He pulled Mata's history, his other reports, his finances, and what he found was a man who had been struggling, behind on his own business, taking private jobs at the edges of his license, and among his recent payments, traced through a small consulting account, was a sum that had come, indirectly, through one of Evan Ellison's failing companies. Not a large amount. Just enough. Just enough to buy a quick report and a quicker conclusion. Just enough for a desperate man to write the word electrical and not look too closely at the floor. It was the first hard wire connecting Evan directly to the cover-up. The fire connected to the accelerant connected to the lie, and now the lie connected, by a thin but traceable thread of money, straight back to the man who profited from it. But evidence takes time to become charges, and I knew we did not have time. Because while we were carefully building our case, Evan was racing to spend his prize before anyone could stop him. And the prize he wanted most was the $3 million in Adeline's trust. That was where Alan went to work. A trust like the one Elizabeth had built does not simply fall into a husband's hands because his wife is in a coma. But a clever lawyer for Evan could petition a court to have him appointed to manage her financial affairs while she was incapacitated. And from there, slowly, legally, begin to move the money. Alan had seen the early signs of exactly that filing being prepared. So he did the thing he had been quietly setting up since the day I first walked into his office. He went to the court first. Alan filed an emergency motion to freeze the trust. He laid out, carefully, and without yet accusing anyone of arson, the simple alarming facts. A wife incapacitated under suspicious circumstances. An open arson investigation into the fire that put her there. A husband with crushing debts and a documented financial motive who stood to control her fortune. The trust, Alan argued, must be locked down and protected until the investigation was complete and Adeline could speak for herself. The judge agreed. The trust was frozen. Not $1 could move without the court's permission. I will never forget Alan's call telling me it was done. For the first time since the night of the fire, I felt something loosen in my chest. Evan could no longer touch her money. The insurance claim was now tangled in an active fraud investigation and would pay out nothing. The life insurance, with an arson finding looming, was frozen solid. Every dollar he had burned my daughter to reach was now locked away behind a wall of law and evidence, just out of his grasp. He did not know it yet. That was the part I held on to. He was still out there, playing the grieving husband, certain he had gotten away with it, while underneath him every wire he was standing on had already been cut. I sat at my kitchen table that night, with everything spread out in front of me. The lab report, Mata's payment trail, Alan's freeze order, Adeline's letter and her drive, Lucas's analysis, Harper's quiet watch over my daughter's bed, Johan Martinez, now hunting on our side. Each piece on its own could be argued with, but laid together, they formed a single complete circuit. Every connection sound, running from the fire on that floor, straight to the man who set it. The case was built. The wiring was done. All that remained was to throw the switch. The call came from Harper Vang a little after 6 in the morning. I had learned to dread the phone at that hour. But the moment I heard her voice, I knew this was different. There was an edge of something in it I had not heard from her before. Something underneath the professional calm. "Mr. Compton," she said, "you should come in. Now." Not in a panic. "She's stable. But there's been a change. And I want you here before he is." I was dressed and in the truck in 4 minutes. When I reached the intensive care unit, Harper met me at the doors and walked me back quickly, talking low. Overnight. Adeline's sedation had been lightened on schedule, part of the careful work of bringing her up out of the medical sleep now that her lungs had begun to heal. And in the early hours, the monitors had picked up something new. Movement, response, her eyelids fluttering, her fingers curling. The doctors were cautious. Harper said, "They would not promise anything. The brain is its own country, and it keeps its own time." But the signs were good. Adeline was beginning, slowly, to surface. I sat down beside her bed and took her hand. And this time, when I held it, the squeeze came back stronger, unmistakable. My throat closed. Her eyes did not open. Not yet. But her brow drew together, the way it used to when she was a girl puzzling over something, and her lips moved without sound. And I leaned close and told her I was there, that her father was right here, that she was safe. For the first time in 2 weeks, I let myself believe she was coming back to me. But Harper had not called me there only for good news. When the doctors had moved on and the room was quiet, she pulled a chair close and lowered her voice again. "There's something else," she said. "His mistress, the pregnant woman. She's been here." I went still. "Here at the hospital, twice this week. She doesn't come to the room. She waits in the parking garage, and he goes down to meet her. I've seen them from the break room window." Harper hesitated. "The first time, they looked like, well, like a couple. But yesterday, it was different. They were arguing. I couldn't hear it. But I didn't need to. She was angry. She kept pointing back at the building, at this floor, and he kept shaking his head. And at one point he grabbed her arm and she pulled away from him hard and walked off." I sat with that for a long moment, and slowly I understood what I was seeing. The walls were beginning to close in on Evan, and he did not even know how much. But he knew enough. He knew the trust had been frozen because Alan's order had been served. He knew the insurance was tangled and not paying. He had set this whole monstrous thing in motion to deliver a fortune and a fresh start to the woman waiting in that parking garage. And now the fortune was locked away. The fire was under investigation. And his wife, who was supposed to die quietly, was instead lying upstairs beginning to wake. And Raina Ballard, with a child months from being born and a man who had promised her everything, was watching that everything slip away. A woman like that does not stay loyal to a sinking ship. She had tied her future to Evan's promises, and the promises were turning to ash. Of course she was angry. Of course she was pointing at the building, at the wife who would not die on schedule, at the failure of the plan she had counted on. Two people who commit a terrible thing together are bound only as long as it is working. The moment it begins to fail, the very thing that joined them becomes the thing that turns them against each other. Each one starts to think the same cold thought. How do I get out of this? How do I make sure that when it all comes down, it comes down on the other one, and not on me? I did not yet know exactly how that crack between them would open. But I knew it was there now. A hairline fracture in their foundation. And I knew, from a lifetime of watching structures fail, that a crack like that does not heal. It only grows, quietly, under load, until the day the whole thing comes apart. I look down at my daughter, at her fingers moving against mine, at her face beginning to find its way back to itself. How long, I asked Harper, until she can talk? Days, maybe, if she keeps improving. The doctors won't say. Days. If Adeline woke and could tell what she knew, with her letter and her drive and the lab report and the frozen trust all behind her, then it would be over. The witness Evan had tried to silence forever would sit up in her bed and speak, but it cut both ways, and the cold part of my mind knew it. Because the one thing more dangerous to a desperate man than a witness who is silenced is a witness who is about to wake up and talk. If Evan understood that Adeline was surfacing, he would have every reason in the world to finish what the fire had failed to do, and far less time to do it in. As if she had heard the thought, Adeline's fingers tightened around mine again, and then, slowly, her eyes began to open. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning, in a conference room at Alan Jimenez's office. I had asked for everyone to be there. Alan, with his folders squared on the table. Lucas, the old fire marshal, with his photographs of the burn pattern. Johan Martinez, the insurance investigator who 3 weeks ago had looked at me like I was a suspect, and now sat on my side of the table. And me, Sullivan Compton, 67 years old, an electrician who had spent his whole life making sure things did not catch fire, sitting in a room trying to prove that someone had made one on purpose. Evan came at 10 sharp. He had a lawyer with him, a slick man in a gray suit who set down a briefcase like he was laying down a weapon. Evan looked at me and smiled, that easy broker's smile that had fooled my daughter. And he said it was good of me to arrange a family talk. I did not smile back. I had decided, days ago, that I would not let him see anything in my face. A circuit does not get angry. It just carries the current to where it has to go. Alan began. He laid it out the way you lay out wire in a wall, one run at a time, clean and labeled. The fire originated in the center of the living room, away from any outlet, any switch, any junction box. Lucas slid the photographs across the table. The poor pattern, the deep char where no electrical source existed, the smell that 3 trained men had recognized. Then the lab report, petroleum distillate, lighter fluid, in plain language. Not aluminum wiring, not an arc fault, not the thing Kenzo Mata had written in his report. Evan's lawyer said that an independent fire was tragic, but that none of this connected his client to anything. He was right, in a way. A burn pattern does not have a name attached to it. So Alan moved to the next run of wire, the money, the $2 million in collapsed debt, the liens, the lawsuit, the trust of a little over $3 million that Evan could not touch, while Adeline was alive and competent, and married to him, but could, through inheritance, if she died. The life insurance policy he had quietly increased a year before. And then the payment. The small, careful payment that had moved out of Evan's failing company and into the hands of Kenzo Mata, the man who had written that the fire was an accident. I watched Evan's face when Johan said Mata's name. It was the first time the smile slipped. Just for a second. Just a flicker, like a bulb when the voltage drops. But I saw it. I had spent 40 years reading the small signs that tell you something is wrong behind a wall you cannot open. And I read this one too. His lawyer leaned in and whispered to him. Evan recovered. He said this was all coincidence and speculation, that a desperate old man was grasping for someone to blame because he could not accept that his own wiring had failed. He looked at me when he said the last part. He wanted it to land. A month ago it might have. A month ago, I had lain awake wondering if somehow, after all my care, I had missed something. But I had read the origin myself. I knew the truth of my own hands, so I spoke for the first time. I did not raise my voice. I told him that I had wired that house, that I had stood in it and chosen every breaker and tightened every connection, because it was my daughter's home, and I would not let it be anything less than safe. And I told him that electricity leaves a trail. It always does. You can hide a lot of things in this world, but you cannot make a fire start where there is nothing to start it. Someone had to stand in that room and put it there. The room was very quiet. Then Alan set down the last folder. He said there was one more thing we had not yet shown to Mr. Ellison's counsel, and he looked at me because we had agreed I would be the one to say it. I told Evan that Adeline had known, before the fire, that she had found out about the affair, about the pregnancy, about everything. That she had gone to a lawyer 3 weeks before her house burned and asked how to protect her trust and how to end her marriage. And that she had written it all down and hidden it where no one would think to look, because she had been afraid of what her husband might do. I did not say there was a USB. I did not say where it was. I wanted him to wonder. I wanted him to sit there and not know exactly how much we had, and watch him do the math, the way a man does when he realizes the breaker has already tripped and there is nothing left to switch back on. His lawyer asked for a recess, and as Evan stood, I saw him pull out his phone, his thumb already moving, and I knew exactly who he was about to call. The one person left who could sink him faster than I could, Raina. The recess lasted 20 minutes. I spent it in the hallway with a paper cup of coffee I did not drink, watching the door of the conference room stay shut. Alan stood beside me and said nothing. He had been a lawyer long enough to know that some currents you do not interrupt. You just wait for them to find ground. What I did not know, sitting in that hallway, was what was happening on the other end of Evan's phone call. I learned it later, piece by piece, from Johann and from the detectives who came after. But I have put it together since, the way I put together a fault in a wall, and I am certain of how it ran. Evan called Raina to tell her to keep quiet. He told her the old man was bluffing, that there was no real proof, that she only had to hold steady and say nothing. But Raina was not a woman who held steady. She was 7 months pregnant, alone in an apartment Evan paid for with money that no longer existed. And for 2 weeks, she had been watching the man who promised her everything turn into a man, with frozen accounts, and a lawyer, and a wife who would not die on schedule. She had already begun to understand what I understood, that Evan did not love her either, that she was not his partner. She was his witness. And a man who would burn his wife to solve a problem would not hesitate over the woman who could put him in prison. So when Evan told her to stay quiet, Raina heard it for what it was, a threat dressed as reassurance. And she made the only move that could save herself. She called a lawyer of her own. Then she called Johann Martinez, whose card she had found in Evan's jacket, and she told him she wanted to talk. That is the thing about 2 people who commit a crime together. Each of them spends the rest of their lives knowing the other one can sink them. The circuit they build runs both ways. The current that protects them is the same current that destroys them the moment one of them reaches for the switch. The meeting never resumed. Evan's lawyer came out and said his client was leaving, that any further communication would go through counsel. Evan walked past me without the smile. He did not look at me at all. He looked like a man who could hear something humming in the walls and could not find where it came from. 3 days later, Raina sat down with 2 detectives and Johann and a recorder running, and she told them everything. How Evan had complained for months that Adeline was about to ruin him, How he had grown calm in a way that frightened her the week before the fire. How he had been gone on a business trip with an alibi too neat to be real. And how he had come back smelling, just faintly, of something she could not name until later. She told them about Kenzo Mata, whom Evan had bragged about handling. She did not do it because she was sorry. I want to be honest about that. She did it to save herself and her child. But the truth does not care about the motive of the person who finally speaks it. It only cares about being spoken. They arrested Evan on a Thursday morning. Arson, insurance fraud, and, because Adeline had survived, attempted murder. Kenzo Mata was arrested the same week and charged with falsifying an official report and accepting a bribe. His career, the badge he had used to write a lie, was gone. I was not there for the arrest. Alan called and told me, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, in the quiet house I had shared with Elizabeth, and I felt no triumph. I had expected to. For weeks, I had imagined the moment, and in my imagination it felt like justice landing clean. But what I felt instead was tired. A heavy, hollow kind of tired. My daughter was in a hospital bed because the man she married had decided her life was worth less than his debts. No arrest gives that back, but Elizabeth had taught me something, years ago, that I held on to that morning. She used to say that doing the right thing does not always feel good, it just feels right. And those are not the same. I had not lifted a hand against Evan. I had not become the thing he was. I had taken the truth, the way I had taken current my whole working life, and I had carried it carefully, all the way to where it had to go. And I had let it do the work that anger never could. The frozen trust stayed frozen, safe now, waiting for Adeline. The insurance would not pay a man who set the fire. Every door Evan had tried to open had closed on him, one circuit at a time. That afternoon the phone rang again. It was Harper Vang, at the hospital. Her voice was different, lighter than I had heard it in weeks. She said I should come. Right away, she said. Adeline had opened her eyes. I do not remember the drive to the hospital. I remember leaving the kitchen table, and I remember Harper meeting me at the door of the unit. And the 20 minutes between are gone, burned out of memory, the way a fuse burns clean when too much passes through it at once. Harper put her hand on my arm before she let me in. She told me to go slow. Adeline was awake, but she was weak, and she did not yet know any of it. Not the arrest, not Raina, not what her husband had done. Harper said all of that could wait. What mattered now was that my daughter saw a face she trusted. I went in. Adeline was propped up against the pillows, thinner than I had ever seen her. Her hands wrapped where the burns had been worst, her eyes half open and unfocused. But they found me. They found me, and they held. And her lips moved, and the word that came out, barely a breath, was the same word I had built my whole life around. Dad, I have been a strong man my whole life. I carried beams when I was young, and I carried grief when I was old. And I didn't let either one bend me. But I sat down in the chair beside my daughter's bed, and I took her bandaged hand as gently as I have ever held anything. And I wept. I am not ashamed to say it. There are currents a man cannot break, and the one that runs between a father and his child is the strongest I know. The days that followed came slowly, the way recovery always does. Adeline slept more than she woke at first. Her body had taken in smoke and heat, and the doctor said the road back would be long. But each day there was a little more of her, a little more focus in her eyes, a few more words. Then whole sentences, then questions. The questions were the hardest part. I had decided I would not lie to her. I had spent a month uncovering lies, pulling them out of walls and burn patterns and bank records, and I would not start telling my own. So when she was strong enough, with Harper nearby and Alan there too, I told her the truth. All of it. The fire that was not an accident, the lab report, the money, Raina, and the child Raina carried, the trust her husband had wanted, and what he had been willing to do to reach it. She did not cry the way I had feared she would. She had known some of it already, from before the fire, from the night she confronted Evan with everything she had found. What broke her was not the betrayal. She had survived that once. What broke her was learning how far he had gone, that the man she had married had stood in her living room and made a decision to end her life. She said, very quietly, that she had thought the worst thing he could do to her was leave. She had not imagined this. I held her hand and told her the only true thing I had, that it was over, that he could not reach her anymore, that the doors were all closed. The legal machinery ground on through the winter. Evan's lawyer tried everything. He argued the evidence was circumstantial, that the payment to Kenzo Mata proved nothing, that an old electrician's word against a fire report was not enough. But the lab report did not lie, and Lucas Nolan's testimony did not waver. And Johan Martinez laid out the money trail one connection at a time, until even a stranger could follow it. And when Raina took the stand, pregnant and angry and exact, the last circuit closed. The jury did not take long. Evan was convicted on every count: arson, insurance fraud, attempted murder. The judge gave him a sentence measured in decades, and I sat in the courtroom and watched them lead him out. And he did not look back, and I felt the same hollow tiredness I had felt the morning of his arrest. Kenzo Mata took a plea. He lost his certification, his pension, and a few years of his freedom. The badge he had used to write a lie was gone for good. Raina, who had helped build the thing and then helped tear it down, was not charged in the end. There was talk of it. But she had not known about the fire until after, and her testimony was the spine of the case. She had her child that spring. I never met her, and I held no warmth for her. But I have thought about that baby more than once. A child born into the wreckage of all of it, who chose none of it. I hope someone wires that child's life with more care than its father ever showed. The trust stayed safe. 3 million and more, frozen through the worst of it, released back to Adeline when the dust settled. She did not want it at first. She said it felt like blood money. I told her it was the opposite. It was what her husband had been willing to kill for and hadn't gotten. Keeping it, using it, building something good with it, was the one thing he could never take back. And slowly, as the snow melted off the burned lot where her house had stood, my daughter began to talk about what she might build there next. They cleared the burned lot in early spring. I stood at the edge of it the morning the crew finished, looking at the bare ground where my daughter's house had been. And I tried to feel the grief I had carried all winter. It came, but it came different now. Not as a fire, as ash that had finally gone cold. Adeline came to stand beside me. She was stronger by then. The bandages were gone, though the scars on her hands remained, faint and pale. And I noticed she had stopped hiding them. She looked at the empty lot the way she looked at a patch of dead ground in one of her gardens. Not as ruin, as something waiting. She said she wanted to build it back, and she said she wanted me to wire it. I told her she did not have to ask. I had wired that house once with all the care I had, and a man had used a can of lighter fluid to undo it in a single night. There was a part of me, I admit, that wondered what the point was. You can do everything right, and someone can still come along and burn it down. I had spent 40 years making things safe, and the most dangerous thing in my daughter's life had not been a frayed wire or a failing breaker. It had been the man who slept beside her. But Elizabeth would have had an answer for that. And I think I finally found it standing on that cold ground. You do not wire a house because nothing will ever go wrong. You wire it because the people inside deserve someone who did everything right. The care is not a guarantee. The care is the point. So we built it back. Through the spring and into the summer, I drove out to that lot most mornings, with my tools in the bed of the same old truck I had driven the night of the fire. I ran the wire myself, every length of it, the way I always had. New copper. Arc fault breakers on every circuit, a panel I could be proud of. And this time Adeline worked beside me when she could, learning the names of things, asking why a connection had to be tight, why a ground mattered. I taught her the way my father had taught me, slowly, with patience, with the understanding that the things that keep you safe are usually the things you cannot see. One afternoon, with the framing up and the late sun coming through the studs, she asked me how I had known, from the very start, how I had stood in front of that fire and known it was a lie when everyone else, the investigator, the insurance man, even the police at first, had been ready to call it an accident. I thought about it for a while before I answered. And then I told her the truest thing I know. The thing this whole long winter had only confirmed. Electricity does not lie. You can argue with a man. You can be fooled by a smile. People will tell you what you want to hear and hide what you do not. But current obeys laws that no one can bribe or charm or talk their way around. It goes where the physics sends it, and it leaves a mark exactly where it has been. And if you know how to read those marks, the truth is right there in front of you whether anyone wants it to be or not. The truth is like that too. I told her, you can bury it. You can pay a man to write it down wrong. You can set a fire over the top of it and hope it burns away. But it doesn't burn. It waits in the ground, in a clay pot on a windowsill, in a burn pattern that does not match the story, in the testimony of someone who finally decides to stop being afraid. And sooner or later, like current finding ground, it finds its way back out. It always does. You only have to be patient enough and careful enough to carry it the whole way. We finished the house in the fall, almost a year to the day from the night it burned. The evening we turned the power on for the first time. Adeline flipped the switch in the front room herself, the room where a man had once knelt and tried to end her life, and the lights came on, warm and steady and clean. She stood there in the glow of them, and she cried. And this time, I knew they were the right kind of tears. I am an old man now, older than I was when this began, and not only in years. I lost a great deal that I cannot get back. But I sat in my daughter's new kitchen that night, in the house we built together with our own hands, and I understood that the thing Evan Ellison had tried hardest to destroy was the one thing he never touched. Not the money, not the house. The bond between a father and his child. He could not burn that. No one can. So if you have made it this far with me, let me leave you with the one thing I would want you to carry out of this. When something in your life feels wrong, when the story you are being told does not match the marks you can see with your own eyes, trust the marks. Be patient. Carry the truth carefully, all the way to where it needs to go. It is heavier than anger, and slower, but it is the only current that reaches the end. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, stay a while. There are more truths worth carrying, and I will be here to tell them.